Hello, I'm Bill Robb, a CUPE Education Representative. It's my pleasure to be here today with Dr. Linda Ray Murray. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be back in Canada.
Great. Dr. Murray is the Cook County Chief Medical Officer in the Illinois Department of Public Health and also past president of the American Public Health Association. And I'm happy to report an ex-CUPE member from some time spent in Manitoba, in Winnipeg. Today, we're going to talk about racism and the world we live and work in. Who's benefiting from racism now?
Today in Canada and the United States, many people benefit from racism. The people who benefit most from it are the capitalists, people who are making money off of keeping us separated, keeping us fighting with each other. They get the most benefit. But racism is embedded in our culture, in our nation, and all of us, even if we're not personally attacking someone of another race, even if we're not personally expressing racist thoughts, we benefit from the structure of the society. And so there's privilege that's built in if you're a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or if you're a man. And we have to recognize that, and we have to make sure that we eliminate that kind of structural racism.
How do you see the effects of racism in North American workplaces?
Well, I think we can see it everywhere in North America. This is a part of the world that was built on racism in terms of our history, first against our native people and with the slave trade, and then waves and waves of different immigrants. So it's part of the fabric of both Canada and the United States. And we can see this reflected in the workplace by where people work. Still throughout North America, people tend to work in certain ghettos. We can see it by what kinds of jobs, what level of jobs people rise to. Racism functions in the workplace just like it functions outside of the workplace, and it has a direct effect on how people relate to each other and on their health. Challenging racism is part of the heart and soul of the union movement. After all, it's one for all and all for one. That's the mantra of what we do. And if we're really going to function like brothers and sisters and deal with the real problems we face in Canada and the United States, then we have to put aside racism. Racism is an ideology that's tied to a time and place. It's not the same as discrimination. You know, what one can argue, we've always had discrimination. If I come from a different village, people may look at me askance. Racism was really designed to suggest that certain groups of people were inferior because of their race or ethnicity. And this really helped capitalism. It really helped the ruling class. It really helps the bosses. So the real reason for unions to fight against it and to understand it and to find ways to address it in the broad society is because that makes our union movement stronger, and that really fights against the bosses.
So we can have a racism-free workplace sign up, but it takes a lot more than that, doesn't it?
It does take a lot more than that. It takes constant effort.
Personal prejudice is common, but racism runs deeper than that. How does North American history come into it?
Well, when you think about it, you have to have a real reason for coming to a new world and exterminating the native people. And that's hard to do if you really think of them as your equal. And so it really was critical to how capitalism developed, how our nations, both Canada and the United States, developed historically to be able to place Native Americans, for example, as subhuman, as somehow less than Europeans. And then obviously our economies were tied together and really built, as much of Europe's economy was built, on the slave trade for African slaves. And so then again, it becomes important, what justification would you have for having slavery, for selling people in the marketplace? That is very difficult to do. It can be done if you dehumanize people. And so I consider racism as an ideology part and parcel of the development of capitalism. And it's central to its functioning, and we can still see it today. How is it possible that we can happily buy iPhones, built, none of them in North America, built on not slave labor, but clearly really oppressed labor in Canada and other parts of Asia. So it's really by us rejecting this ideology and understanding that we in fact are all brothers and sisters, that we can begin to expect that we shouldn't have an iPhone based on someone else's oppression. And so bringing that home and making that part of our everyday workplace in North America, even though we're relatively privileged workers, becomes critical to what the labor movement's about.
Is anybody actually benefiting from racism in North America today?
I think so. I think the issue of privilege is there. It does not require you to actively do something bad. If you are a white male, there are privilege that comes with that. And so just like there's privilege being a North American when you travel other places in the world. And so we structurally have created a society where if you have certain race and ethnicity, you have a better chance of getting things: education, housing, jobs, etc. So race and class and gender are three major ways that we distribute resources in North America. And so as labor people, we need to understand that when we really have real equality, then we'll distribute those resources in a more equal and fair way.
How does racism get embedded in our institutions like education or healthcare or government?
I think that because it is so much a fabric of what goes on in North America, it's hard for people to see it every day. Again, it doesn't have to be overt, personal, me calling you a bad name. If you live in communities with well-paid schools that are well-financed, and those you have residential segregation with that, then if you're Native or if you're African or if you're Native American or African American or Asian, you may find yourself with a different quality school, different quality housing, different quality jobs. So we can see it in an everyday way. I can talk clearly in a concrete way about my home city, Chicago. In the city of Chicago, in some of our communities, for every 100 black boys that start kindergarten, only 3 have a bachelor's degree, have finished college by the time they're 25. That's structural racism that's going on there, and it's there at every point along the way.
So about that structural racism, you talked a moment ago just about how colonialism has affected us, in fact, created some of the very system that we live in. So how does that relate, that history also of colonialism, back to the structural or systemic racism of today?
I think that our history is built just like a house, so brick by brick. And that's why it's so hard to address these, because it's hard to go, you have to go back to the foundations of the country to really root out the problems of racism. People, we've done studies after study and show that people have these racist notions in their heads, subtly there, they're completely unaware of them, because they're so much a part of the country. So my son is the son of a doctor. When he goes Christmas shopping, he's assumed to be a young gang kid. Well, he's a young man now, a young black man, gang-infested thug, even though he may be there with his children, doing Christmas shopping. So the structural racism that we see, I think, does the most harm in the workplace, in our educational institutions, and in our communities. In the United States particularly, we have residential segregation is so blatant and so common. So even things like what kind of park your child can play in is determined by what neighborhood you live in. What libraries are there. Some neighborhoods have libraries, some neighborhoods don't. So this is what we mean when we talk about institutional and structural racism built into our institutions and systems, our labor unions, and it's difficult to address. I think one of the challenges for labor, Canadian labor as well as American labor, is this very fact. Who are our officers? Does the leadership of the union reflect the membership of the union in terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity? And too often that's not the case. And so we have to find ways to understand each other. We have to find ways to break down those barriers. So when someone can scare you based on racism, that immigrants are coming to get you, or dark people are invading the nation, the purity of the nation is at risk, then you're willing to tolerate policies that hurt you and your family because you think there's a wider, larger, darker evil out there, which is, again, one of the critical reasons we have to address racism. So the real challenge for us in North America is how can we work with our friends and neighbors and family to make them understand that we have the same interests and that we have an obligation not only to each other in Canada or in the United States, but we have an obligation to the world to play a leadership role. And so this is the real challenge that we face for the next bunch of years.
So in CUPE, we have negotiated some partnership agreements with Aboriginal organizations, government, employers, and union involvement, with the goal being to achieve a representative workforce. In other words, the workforce should look like the community that it's in. And we've had some success, but we've also had right-wing governments come in and cut the programs. I guess I'd like to ask you if you have any ideas you'd like to share with us about how we can challenge as a union some of the structural racism that we see?
Well, I think there are a number of methods that we've used in Western Europe and North America for the past several decades, and you've mentioned some of them. Programs that try to force representation. And I think those are needed. In the United States we call them affirmative action programs. I personally support them. I think they're absolutely needed. But you don't even have to think of them in that way. The question is, what can we do temporarily in the short term right now to make sure that our workforce, the leadership of our unions, reflect the communities in which they serve? If you are trying to hire a technical worker and your education system is bad, you may have trouble finding enough people of color with those technical skills. And so, again, making sure, at least certainly I would argue for CUPE in the public sector, that we make sure that we find as many as we can becomes important. But clearly working on the education system, working on these other conditions, take decades to really resolve the problem. That's why I think special programs, for lack of a better term, affirmative action programs, become critical, because otherwise we're going to be waiting decades before that representation happens. The second thing that I think is important, because what the right wing says is that this is somehow unfair to most people. That's how they attack.
Reverse discrimination, they might say.
It's very, I would remind brothers and sisters, first, it's hard to discriminate if you don't have power. So that's the first problem I have, It's hard to do that if you don't have power. And what we need to say is we need to make sure that not only the workforce, but the union leadership, the village council, the provincial legislature reflect the people. And that means that we have women there in reasonable numbers. We have immigrants there in reasonable numbers. It doesn't have to be an exact formula. And one way to think about it is if that reflection doesn't happen naturally, it means there's a problem, a disease, I'm going to call it racism or discrimination, in the society, in the union, in the local. And we have to, just like I'm a physician, so if there's something, if your blood pressure is too high, I'm going to find some pill to give you to lower your blood pressure so you don't have a stroke. That's how I think about these programs. If we look at our city council and we see all white men, there's a problem there. And so we have to find ways to solve that problem. One of those ways are affirmative action program. Other ways are better education, to really mobilize and organize the community to fight for their rights. We know as labor people that when you organize workers to fight for their rights, lots of things get better.
Anything else you'd like to share with us?
I think that I want Canadians to be proud of the differences between Canada and the United States. Canada is a racist nation. There's no question about it. But you live next to probably the most racist nation in the world. And how Canadians, and particularly the Canadian labor movement, has chosen to directly confront this problem and talk about it and grapple with it and struggle with it, you should be proud of. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but at least the work has begun, and at least there are people interested in that. So I think that that's something that Canada can teach, certainly the United States and the rest of the world, that here's a nation that tries in a very real way to address problems of racism on an everyday basis in the communities and government and our labor unions. And so in that sense, I congratulate my brothers and sisters in Canada and ask you to keep up the good work.
Thank you very much for joining us in this conversation today.
Well, thank you, Bill.